Hey everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to break down the Fei Ranis theory, and we'll do it in a way that's easy to get your head around. So what is it? Well, this theory basically explains how a poor country, one that's super dependent on farming, can become a modern industrial nation. You could almost call it the story of a country's journey from the farm to the factory. So, to really understand that journey, let's take a quick look at our roadmap. We're going to see where this theory even came from, break down its essential parts, and then, at the end, we'll talk about its criticisms and what the real takeaway is. All right, let's dive in. To really get a handle on what Fei and Ranis were talking about, we first have to understand the idea that it was all built on, the model from economist Arthur Lewis. It's one of the most fundamental questions in economics, right? How do poor nations with huge populations actually become wealthy? Well, Arthur Lewis was one of the first to really tackle this with his dual economy model. Lewis's idea was a real game changer. He said you take surplus workers from farming, what he called the subsistence sector, and move them into factories, or the capitalist sector. That's what fuels growth. But his model had a massive blind spot. It pretty much ignored agriculture. It just assumed farms would provide an endless supply of workers, but it never really asked the crucial question: who's going to grow the extra food to feed all these new factory workers? And that's exactly where Fei and Ranis step in. So John Fei and Gustav Ranis basically filled that gap in Lewis's model. They created a much more complete framework that really focused on the relationship between agriculture and industry. You could call it the real blueprint for economic transformation. Now, every theory is built on a few core assumptions, some ground rules. Fei and Raganisi set up a few simple ones. The economy has two parts: a stagnant farm sector and a dynamic industrial one. Farming depends on just land and labor, and land is limited. And most importantly, they assumed that in the agricultural sector, there are surplus workers whose productivity is practically zero. Now, here's a really key concept: the institutional wage. It's a simple idea, really. It just means that the workers who move from the village to the city factory will get paid the same amount they were earning, on average, back on the farm. At least that's the starting point. Okay, so now we get to the absolute heart of the theory. Fei and Ranis lays out this whole transformation as a three-phase journey, that path from the farm to the factory that completely reshapes the entire economy. Now, I know this graph might look a little intimidating at first, but don't worry. This one image tells the entire story of the theory. It shows how labor moves from agriculture to industry and the effect that has on the economy. We're going to break it down piece by piece and walk through each phase nice and slow. These are the three main steps that put a country on the path to self-sustained growth. First, you reallocate the surplus labor. Then comes a period called the agricultural squeeze. And finally, you get the commercialization of agriculture. Phase 1 is pretty straightforward. This is where you move workers from farms to factories, who, honestly, weren't really contributing much in the first place. They're called the disguised unemployed. And the most fascinating part is that when they leave, total farm output doesn't drop at all, because they weren't adding any real value to begin with. Okay, now in phase 2, things get interesting. We start moving workers who actually were doing some productive work on the farm, even if their output was less than their wage. As soon as these people leave, food production starts to fall. This creates food shortages, prices go up, and this is what's known as the Lewis turning point. Now industry has to start paying its workers more. And finally, we hit phase 3. At this point, there's no more surplus labor on the farms. The farmers who remain are incredibly productive. So much so that their output is now higher than the institutional wage. Agriculture is no longer just for survival, it's become a modern business. The economy is now primed for self-sustained growth. So, what's powering this entire transformation? It all comes down to one thing: the agricultural sector. It is the true engine room for all of this growth. This brings us to another critical concept: total agricultural surplus, or TAS. Think of it like this. It's the extra food left over after the farmers have taken what they need to live on. This surplus is what feeds all the new factory workers who've moved to the city. And that leads to the average agricultural surplus, or AAS. You can imagine it as a sort of lunchbox. Every worker who goes from the farm to the factory metaphorically carries this lunchbox of food with them. How much food is in it? That's the AAS. It tells you how much surplus is available for each new worker. This slide highlights something incredibly important. For healthy development, you need balanced growth. This means some of the profits from the factories have to be reinvested back into agriculture to boost productivity there. The rest goes back into industry to create even more jobs. Both sectors have to grow together, hand in hand. So we've understood the theory, but how well does it hold up in the real world? It's really important to look at the criticisms of the model and figure out the ultimate takeaway. Well, critics point out that the model makes a lot of assumptions that just aren't true in reality. For example, it assumes a country can't just import food. It also assumes that a worker's productivity can actually be zero, which is a hot debate. And the idea that wages stay the same forever? That's just not realistic. But despite those criticisms, the real genius of this model is right here. It systematically shows that the development process only moves forward through the interaction between industry and agriculture. Neither one can succeed without the other. They are completely intertwined. So we'll leave you with this question to think about. Can a nation truly become an industrial powerhouse while neglecting its farmers? The Fei Ranis theory has a pretty clear answer. What do you think? Thanks for watching.